Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm going to be trying my hand at making some pixel art in the style of a watercolor painting. I'm getting started here with a bit of testing on how to best capture that style. So I'm experimenting with the appearance of a watercolor brushstroke and how there could be some tailing to it and also a slight bit of outline along the edges. The other thing was just to capture that idea of a soft blending between colors, whether that be from one color into a different color, or kind of stepping a singular color toward the lightness of the underlying background itself. The color palette I'm using is a custom set that I put together ahead of time. And what I did was I started by taking 4 initial colors that I liked. So I've got here a red, yellow, green, and purple of a fairly moderate saturation. And then I created 3 equal steps of color between those, made using a 25, 50, and 75% opacity of one color over the other. So these are just laid out as a continuous square, so we're missing the connections between the 2 opposing corners, and I've just kind of placed those below as isolated strips. Next, I essentially unhinged and unwound that square to lay everything out as a vertical strip. And finally, to simulate the idea of kind of watering down the paint, I've taken that strip and created 3 steps of opacity, again at 75, 50, and 25% to yield the final palette. In terms of the total number of colors, this ends up being a much larger palette than I typically work with in a pixel art piece, but it felt necessary to have this sort of extensive connectivity just in order to approximate the natural type of gradient that you could achieve in a true watercolor technique. The idea that I see pixel art bringing to the table, though, is this sort of reduction or simplification of that continuous gradient into these discrete steps of color and discrete steps of opacity. With my small experiments here, I started testing these little leaf and flower shapes because I wanted to go ahead now and create a full flower bouquet. Making some flowers just sort of felt like the kind of thing that I associate with the watercolor style. You know, maybe that's a common exercise probably. And beyond that, they just feel organic enough that it might give me a bit of forgiveness into how it actually turns out. I'm getting started by approaching the line work and then filling that in and softening the colors. The space in which I'm creating these flowers is approximately 30 by 40 pixels, which is actually quite a small area even for pixel art. But my thinking was that the novelty of me attempting a watercolor style in pixel art is that it should be obviously pixely. And so I decided to use this smaller resolution so that that aspect of it was quite apparent. In the case of the flowers, I think this approach came in a little bit extreme. There's some nice softness from using the palette, but proportionally the line work here takes up most of this space. So there's not really a lot of room to really flex that idea of blending colors and making the watercolor brush appearance. But that's all right. This is all a bit of a study anyway, so it's kind of worth trying what works and what doesn't. The next thing I wanted to try is more along the lines of the classic still life approach to art and just making a single pair. I found a great watercolor tutorial online, which I'll link below, and it talked about how to capture the look as a study of value, meaning to just plan out and think about the discrete steps of contrast that go on to define the contour and the lighting of a shape. Seeing it described like this is very much the kind of thing that's important in pixel art as well, because you're often forcing things into those discrete steps because you want to tend to work with a restricted color palette. So I'm following something similar to this and just using a photo reference rather loosely to create mine. In capturing the various greens and yellows, I've tried to shift through those hues while making things brighter or darker. So when looking at the palette, I was kind of making these diagonal movements through the color, starting from the green as the darkest and becoming more yellow as it also gets brighter. The final touch was to use individual pixels as the speckling texture of the pear itself. The last thing I wanted to do was just something a little bit more fun. So I'm making a big, simple, smiley emoji kind of thing. And again, I'm starting with the line work and a fill color, and these ones are going to be the darkest or most saturated colors that I use. And then I'm going to soften that with some lighter colors to create some dimension and texture. By the way, I should mention that, this is obviously a really just sort of superficial attempt at capturing some flavor of an actual watercolor styling. I obviously still have a lot to learn in that regard. But overall, the most refreshing thing about this exercise was just kind of this freedom to take a different approach to pixel art rendering than I naturally would have. I started getting into this idea a little bit, and sort of introducing some little extra spots and bleeding to try to simulate some of those little organic accidents as if you were doing this by a tangible medium. Which is kind of ironic because on my part, making this as a digital piece, it's totally contrived. But it's still quite a bit of fun regardless to try to find this organic style to it. So here's the final smiley artwork, which I think is actually my favorite out of the bunch today. And just in case there are any Watchmen fans out there, here's an alternate comedian version for you, since you were probably thinking it, as was I. Overall, this was a really fun experiment, and it's something I'm definitely going to have to revisit. And if you're curious about this as well, I've actually organized the palette that I used today into this image, and I'll post a link below if you'd like to grab these colors for yourself. It's not necessarily the most extensive or versatile palette, but I've gone back and added in the blue color as well, so hopefully there's enough here just to get the ball rolling at the very least. And we'll go ahead and close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.